Born into a country where the color of one's skin determined one's fate, he spent a lifetime fighting for a country in which all its peoples would be equal.
It is an idea for which I am prepared to die.
He's got iron will. He sets his mind doing something, and he becomes unshakable.
For 27 years, he continued his fight from behind prison walls.
He steeled himself. He separated his own personal anguish from what he knew he had to do to survive.
3 decades behind bars might have left him a defeated and forgotten man. Instead, he emerged from prison to lead his country to a new beginning.
Mandela is a leader, he's a fighter, was a freedom fighter. Sometimes he goes where angels may fear to tread. That's Mandela.
Now is the time. Vote Mandela for president.
As South Africa's first democratically elected president, he set out to deliver the basics: homes, water and electricity, along with justice and reconciliation. Later, the one-time political prisoner found himself an international political icon, while also finding a new wife and a measure of well-deserved happiness in his personal life.
Throughout our lifetime, we have fought against white domination and have fought against black domination.
February 11th, 1990, a remarkable sight. After 27 years behind bars, Nelson Mandela emerges from prison a free man. He had dedicated his life to the struggle to end the domination of one race by another, and his release promised an entirely new chapter in South Africa's history. It had been a long journey to this moment, a journey that had begun in a remote corner of this beautiful land. The Transkei region of South Africa, a remote land of rolling hills and glistening streams along the Indian Ocean. Here, on July 18, 1918, Nelson Mandela was born into African royalty. His father, a tribal chief, named his son Roli Shasha, which means troublemaker. The world of the young boy was a completely African one, unchanged for hundreds of years.
He was raised in a world apart. It was basically an African world. He didn't grow up amidst whites and have the feeling of inferiority that a lot of Africans do, because his whole world was the world of his mother and father, this world of his village. It was a ritualistic society. Families mattered. He was a herd boy. He went out and herded cattle in the morning. He drank milk from the cow's udders. It was the most simple kind of existence you can imagine.
His father was wealthy by local standards. He had enough cattle to pay for 4 wives, who bore him 13 children. His third wife, Roli Shasha's mother, lived in a neighboring village, and there the young boy spent his early childhood.
It was an idyllic world. I mean, he would stick fight with the other boys, and he was a great stick fighter. They would steal mealies or corn in the evening and roast it under the stars.
But there was a whole other world beyond his village, a white world that the young boy knew only well enough to fear.
Regarded whites as a boy as kind of gods that came from some other place that he didn't know about, and occasionally visited them, and he looked on them with great awe and fear, because he saw the way the elders and even the way his father related to whites, and he knew, the way children know, that there was something going on here that was a little bit frightening to him and daunting.
Roli Shasha was just 7 when this white world had its first great impact on him. His black village teacher decided he'd need a name better suited to a white society.
His first day in school, he was asked his name, and he said, well, my name is Roli Shasha Mandela, and the teacher sort of shuddered a bit and said, oh, well, I'll call you Nelson.
He went home that night and he told his mother that his new name was Nelson. And his mother never was able to even say it, much less call him that. But in school and in the white world, he was thenceforth known as Nelson.
The idyllic life of a village child ended abruptly for Nelson when he was just 9. his father died, and he was taken from his mother to live at the Great Place under the guardianship of the regent, the ruler of the Tembu people. Here, he would be groomed for leadership.
It was like the Emerald City to him. It was Oz. It was fantastic. It was beyond all of his imaginings how grand this place was. This is where the king lived, the regent lived. And he went there and he was, astonished by the grandeur of it.
The Great Place was the center of life for the Tembu people. When issues needed to be resolved, chiefs from the outlying areas would gather here for meetings with the regent.
Nelson watched these in great wonderment and awe, because all of these chiefs were very grand men, they were very articulate, they were very strong, and they would have this meeting, and each of them would speak in turn, and many of them criticized the regent very harshly, and Nelson, as a boy, was amazed by this, and to him it became a symbol of what democracy is really like.
The regent reared Nelson as his own son and groomed him to be an advisor to the next king. For his education, Nelson was sent to an elite boarding school. When Nelson finished boarding school, he was sent to Fort Hare University, the Harvard of Black South Africa. Here, he faced his first moral dilemma. He had been voted to student office in elections he considered unfair. When he refused the position, he was expelled. The issue was not of great note, but Nelson saw it as a matter of principle and would not budge. His stubborn determination to follow his sense of right would characterize him for the rest of his life. The 21-year-old Nelson now returned to the Transkei to discover that the regent had arranged a bride for him. Nelson was shocked. He was not ready for married life, nor was he willing to marry a local girl. So he ran away to Johannesburg. Johannesburg in 1941 opened his eyes to the real South Africa. Here was a world of injustice, driven by the separation of the races. It was a world he'd never before had to face.
I certainly think that his removal and relative protection from the main weight of white racism would have saved him from the crushing impact that so many, the psychological impact that so many black South Africans did suffer.
South Africa in 1941 was not just a country of Africans ruled by whites. It was a country in which Africans were forced to face their diminished status every day of their lives, from morning till night. Separation from whites, that's what defined absolutely an African's life. From the hospital he was born in, to the bus that took him home, to the school he attended. When he reached adulthood, his job was an African's only job. His home, an African's only home. He could be stopped anytime, anywhere, and forced to show his passbook. Documents which listed the areas he could enter. For the first time in his life, Mandela saw himself as a black man in a white society.
In a strange way, the racism of the city was one of the first things that defined him to himself as a black man. And in a way, it started that internal fire burning of resentment that eventually ignited into full-fledged rebellion.
Very soon after his arrival in Johannesburg, in his search for work, he was introduced to Walter Sisulu, a prominent African businessman active in the African National Congress.
He impressed me at once. His demeanor, his manner of approach, and he was a bright and lively young man.
Sisulu saw how powerful a leader of the fight Nelson could become. At this time, the African National Congress was a group made up of activists fighting to end racial injustice through the most moderate means: boycotts, letters, and petitions. For Sisulu, being presented with a man as educated and as regal as Nelson was a dream come true. With Sisulu's help, Mandela started working as a clerk in a law firm during the day and continued his legal studies at night.
Walter started taking him to meetings, and just as he had done as a young boy, he would observe, he would listen. He would listen to the speeches, and he would see the gamut of opinion, and he started to get politicized.
My approach was that I have got the right type of a man. If I can help, I want to develop him as much as I could.
He came along very slow in the organization. He was still shy. He was still reluctant to speak in public. He was still awkward and self-conscious about his English, which he didn't think was very good. So he didn't speak very much in the early days.
It was during this time that Nelson fell in love with Walter Sisulu's cousin Evelyn, and within a few months they were married. It was 1944, near the end of World War II, and a new era was dawning in resistance politics in South Africa. Black South Africans were working in factories in support of this war, being fought in the name of freedom and democracy, which they were denied. It was in the spirit of these ideals that Nelson and the other younger, more militant members of the ANC formed a youth league within the organization to force a more radical approach.
In the black community, it was still a case of yes, master, no, master. And I think that kind of attitude pervaded the general membership of the ANC, and this was what Mandela was challenging and changing with the militancy that he and Sisulu and others brought into the through the Youth League.
The young law clerk who'd hesitated to speak at meetings was shy no longer. He and the others in the Youth League would soon take the ANC in a new direction that would redefine forever the struggle for freedom in South Africa. 1946. Nelson Mandela was 28 years old and beginning to settle into a relatively comfortable life in Johannesburg. His firstborn child was a son, and for the first time he had a home of his own and could enjoy a normal and happy life. But it was not to last. Life for every black South African was about to change. In 1948, white Afrikaans nationalists came to power on the promise of a total separation of the races. The new government quickly adopted brutally repressive laws. The system was called apartheid and was intended to maintain white supremacy forever. Blacks understood at once that they were now the enemy in their own country.
And Nelson himself saw the change in South African life. He saw these laws being passed, and he saw the dark clouds gathering on the horizon, as he once described it, and that focused his mind, focused his own political ambitions.
Determined to fight back, Mandela and other activists launched the Defiance Campaign, a program of non-violent civil disobedience. The campaign spread like wildfire across the black community, from city to city. Africans by the thousands took political action for the first time in their lives and disobeyed the apartheid laws. It was Mandela who organized support for the campaign, and its popular success made him known across the country.
Mandela represented a watershed. The shift from the old constitutional approach to the more defiant, assertive, aggressive approach, and that of course gave him a particular image. He became a symbol of militancy to the youth of that time, and he carried that through into the ANC.
By the end of 1952, Mandela had become such a thorn in the government's side that it decided he had to be silenced, and he was served with a banning order. This severely restricted his freedom of speech and movement. He could not attend public meetings or speak to more than one person at a time. He could not even attend his own son's birthday party. From this point on, Mandela would have to continue the fight from behind the scenes. The first to suffer from the rising pressure was his family.
He tells the story of how on those rare nights that he was home to tuck his children into bed, his son might say, "Daddy, why aren't you home more? Why aren't you tucking us in every night?" And he would have to say these terrible, horrible words, as he described it, which is that there are hundreds of thousands, millions of other children in the world, and I have to be concerned about them as well.
Mandela was fighting apartheid not just politically, but professionally. He and his friend Oliver Tambo opened the only black law firm in South Africa.
This was the mecca for every black person in South Africa who had any legal problems. There was just this one law firm, and people looked up to Mandela and Tambo. And to get into his office every day, he had to walk over dozens of people who were just waiting in the hallways to see him.
Oh, he was the best dressed young man among all of us. He walked tall, and he cross-examined with the witnesses with great confidence. This upset some of the magistrates that he appeared before.
But Mandela faced as much racism in the courtroom as he did on the streets of Johannesburg.
He had white witnesses for cross-examination who refused or tried to refuse to answer questions from a black man who'd never been asked a question by a black man, never had been in an adversarial relationship with a black man where a black man actually had some authority over them. That was revolutionary in those days.
Meanwhile, the government continued to ruthlessly impose apartheid and crush any opposition. Whole communities were forced out of their homes, sometimes at gunpoint, and relocated to barren lands outside the cities. But as the repression increased, so did Mandela's will.
as he saw the national power tightening the screws on life in South Africa, he realized that there was no exit for him. This was his destiny, and things would only get worse on the political front. He couldn't get out now, and he didn't want to.
24 hours a day, Mandela was fighting apartheid every way he could. His whole life had become consumed with the struggle. Then in December of 1956, the state finally made its move. In a nationwide sweep, police arrested Mandela and 155 other activists and charged them with high treason. Nelson's arrest, on top of his unending political work, was more than his wife Evelyn could bear. After 12 years of marriage, she left him. Alone now, Mandela stood trial for treason, and it would take 4 long years before he was found not guilty. Nelson's personal life changed happily during this difficult period. On his way home from the trial one day, he spotted a young woman at a bus stop whose beauty dazzled him. Her name was Winnie Madikizela. He managed to wrangle a date with her, and by the end of the date, he decided to marry her.
Winnie, in a way, was a kind of modern woman in a way that Evelyn had not been. Winnie was one of the kind of earliest modern African women. She was independent. She had her own opinions about things. He saw in her what she later became, which was a feisty, independent, strong woman, and he liked that. He wanted someone that he felt was his equal.
On June 14th, 1958, Nelson and Winnie were married in a small church in the Transkei. The marriage brought Nelson enormous joy, and his deep love for Winnie would fortify him for the struggles ahead. His life was about to take a dramatic turn. In 1960, in a town called Sharpeville, the state showed the violence it was willing to commit to prevent change. At a protest, South African police fired more than 700 times into a crowd of black men, women, and children. 69 people were killed. Rioting quickly erupted throughout the country. The government declared a state of emergency and outlawed the African National Congress.
Combination of this massacre and the banning of peaceful resistance was really the watershed point at which the ANC, led by Mandela at that point, not that he was not yet the leader of the organization, but it was his thinking led the organization to adopt a strategy of guerrilla violence.
With the African National Congress outlawed, Mandela now went underground. One day he was a public figure, by the next he disappeared.
When Mandela went underground, of course, it added to the romantic image of the man. He became very much the idol and the glamorous figure, the heroic figure to the young black South Africans particularly. I mean, they were electrified by his name from that point onwards.
While in hiding, he formed the armed wing of the ANC, Mkhonto iSizwe, or Spear of the Nation, which began to carry out strategic acts of sabotage. For Nelson Mandela, becoming a secret commander meant a life on the run, where his every move had to be carefully planned.
Everything had to be thought out in advance, where he was going to stay that night, how he was going to get from point A to point B. He became a military tactician just in the way he had to live his life, because he had to plan it out like an elaborate campaign every day.
In January of 1962, he was smuggled out of South Africa and traveled extensively around the continent and to London, gathering support and funding for the armed struggle. He received military training in Algeria and Ethiopia. Now, at the age of 43 and away from South Africa, he felt true freedom for the first time in his life. But it would be short-lived. Although he was the most wanted man back home, he would return to continue the fight. In July, Mandela slipped back into South Africa, but was soon captured by the police. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for leaving the country illegally and inciting people to strike. While he was in prison, security police raided the ANC's underground headquarters. Its military high command was captured and charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. Mandela was brought to stand trial with them.
This really was such a shock to all of us, because it was the cream of our liberation people that were taken. A few of them escaped, but these were the people that one really counted on to lead us. And they were all taken in one swoop.
This time, the government's case was rock solid, and Nelson Mandela knew it would seek the ultimate penalty, death.
So that is how we went into the trial. expecting the worst. And his attitude right through was to keep us prepared for this eventuality. So much so that as the trial drew to a close, again he persuaded us that even if we were sentenced to death, there should be no appeal.
Mandela saw the trial as possibly his last chance to tell the world about the South Africa he lived in and the one he dreamed of.
What they were trying to do was to indict the whole South African system. Mandela said, I want to put South Africa on trial. I want to put the oppressors on trial. They would, in effect, plead guilty to the crimes and say, yes, but you are the real criminals.
And so Mandela refused to defend himself. The defense would legitimize the state's case. Instead, he made a passionate address to the court that lasted 4 hours. Mandela closed his speech with perhaps his most famous words: I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if need be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. These were the last words he would speak in public for nearly 30 years. June 12, 1964. At the South African Supreme Court in Pretoria, Nelson Mandela, now 45 years old, was convicted with 7 others of conspiracy to overthrow the government. They were sentenced to life in prison to be served at Robben Island, the Alcatraz of South Africa, a rocky and barren island surrounded by rough seas some 7 miles off the coast of Cape Town.
He spelled it out to us. Our job is to crush your spirits, and this is what we're going to do. In 5 years' time, nobody will know the name of Mandela.
Robben Island was an unimaginably harsh place, completely cut off from the outside world, a place where all life and all time was stopped cold. Here, there were no clocks allowed, no newspapers. The lights burned 24 hours a day. In his first year here, Nelson was allowed just 1 visit from his wife Winnie. It would be another 2 years before he could see her again. It would be 20 years before he could even touch her hand. Inside Robben Island, apartheid was even more brutally imposed than it was outside. Even in the very necessities of life, Mandela and the other black prisoners received the least of everything.
When we had to change into prison clothes, they were all given short pants, I was given long pants. They were given no socks. And the regulation stipulated they should have been wearing sandals, or they were given shoes as a favor. When it came to food again, there was discrimination. Less sugar for them, just boiled mealies at lunch, no bread for them. Less meat, less fish.
From the first day, Mandela was determined never to give in, never to allow himself to be defeated here. He would never submit to disrespect or mistreatment. On the contrary, he would demand the respect due any man. It was this certainty about what's right that allowed him to survive here.
If you enter prison with a negative state of mind, it is hell. Every minute of it can be hell. But when you enter with a positive spirit, as we said, we entered the island or prison, knowing that this is the struggle on another terrain. It was hard, and they did everything to crush our spirits. They failed.
One place Mandela and his fellow prisoners took their stand was at the limestone quarry. Every day, for 13 years, they were marched here, and from morning till night, under the brutal sun, they would do the back-breaking, blistering work of crushing rock. But they also made clear here how they would and would not be treated.
We wouldn't run. We'd never call them boss. We'd work at the pace which we could work at. We are not going to kill ourselves working. When they demanded that when we are breaking stones, we should have a bucket full of stones, we said we'll do what we can.
Once they realized we were determined to do that, there's no way in which they can push us. They had to talk to us. They recognize leadership, which is usually a difficult thing in jail. They now recognize that Mandela Nelson was the leader.
Mandela's behavior astounded his guards. They'd never been confronted by a prisoner with such dignity and self-assurance. That this was someone black as well was dumbfounding. But over the years, Mandela's demeanor succeeded in changing their attitude towards him.
With Nelson Mandela, there came a time when they realized that, look, let's not touch this man. It seems like taboo. The respect started mounting. But not out of a myth, out of Mandela's conduct. He would try to shake the hand of a warder in the morning. He will say, "Goeiemorgen, good morning." He will ask about your children. He would inquire after their wives. They came to fear this person. They came to respect this person. But they came to love Nelson Mandela. And he came to forgive everybody.
He was never defeated, no. Depressed he might have been the fact that he was away from his family, his children, didn't ever see them grow up, and I think that was very sad for him.
The hardship of being away from his family became almost unbearable when his oldest son, Tembi, died in a car accident in 1969. Nelson was not permitted to attend the funeral. Later, he would say that Tembi's death left a hole in his heart that could never be filled. Outside, Winnie Mandela was still fighting against apartheid and being persecuted for it.
This was a cause of great anguish for him. His children had to be sent away to school. They had no money. Winnie was banned and living away from the children. This really tortured him.
Nelson and Winnie had been married for just 6 years when he first went to Robben Island. But the nearly 30 years he was forcibly separated from her never dimmed his love.
I think his passion for Winnie grew while he was in prison. He talks about how while he was in prison, he would touch his nose to a picture of her that he had and experience that same electric thrill that he experienced when he touched her nose in person.
As Mandela was growing old in prison, South Africa's memory of him was fading. Then, in 1976, everything changed when black student protesters were shot and killed by security forces in the black township of Soweto. Suddenly, the whole world took notice, and pressure on the government from inside and outside the country quickly grew. By the mid-1980s, the momentum for change was unstoppable, and Nelson Mandela became a symbol for that change. The call for his release became a rallying cry around the world for all opposed to apartheid.
Nelson Mandela was larger than life. He was a symbol to all of us. He was an inspiration. We rallied around him, around his name, and we wanted to be like him, to give our all to the struggle.
The country was now in turmoil, the economy near collapse. South Africa had become a pariah nation to the rest of the world. The government knew it would have to deal with Nelson Mandela sooner or later. Its worst fear was that he would die in prison, making him a martyr to the cause. In 1985, it took a dramatic step. The government would release Nelson Mandela if he would renounce violence, but he rejected the offer categorically.
My father says, I cannot and will not give any undertaking at a time when I and you, the people, are not free.
Mandela could see how much the government needed him.
Mandela saw the climate changing. He saw the odiousness in which apartheid was held throughout the rest of the world. He saw the situation changing, the tide changing in his favor. He also saw some softening on the part of the government looking for a way out of this mess.
In 1985, Mandela initiated secret meetings with the government that would go on for 5 years. Meetings that would set the stage for the inevitable end of all-white rule. Slowly, the government began to prepare Mandela for his eventual release.
We now know that at that time, Mandela was actually being taken around the country, quietly being prepared for his release, but he'd been lost from view for a whole generation. Nobody knew what he looked like. He turned up on beaches, he walked into shops, nobody recognized him. I mean, it really is a most extraordinary situation. Everybody around the world knew his name, but he could walk the streets of Cape Town and go unrecognized.
In September of 1989, with the election of the pragmatic F.W. de Klerk as president, events began to move faster than anyone expected. Within a month, Walter Sisulu and the others imprisoned for treason were released. Within 2 months, the government began to rescind apartheid laws. By the start of February 1990, the outlawed ANC was declared legal. And then, on the 10th of that month, came electrifying news.
I am now in a position to announce that Mr. Nelson Mandela will be released at the Victor Verster prison on Sunday, the 11th of February, at about 3 p.m.
The atmosphere in the country that night was unimaginable. The next day, the most famous man in South Africa, but a man unseen for nearly 30 years, would emerge into the public light to change the nation's history. The moment had finally arrived. February 11th, 1990. After nearly 30 years, Nelson Mandela, now 71 years old, was at last a free man.
It just seemed like spring was happening in the middle of winter. Our people, I think, felt, hey, well, God, yes, loves us, man. God has heard us, and it's happening. And we are going to enter the promised land.
The country exploded in celebration. In Cape Town, more than 500,000 supporters, black, white, young and old, packed the central square to hear him speak for the first time in nearly 3 decades.
To hear this man who'd been kept away from us for all these years was the most amazing of emotions that many of us felt. For many people, it was a dream come true.
I was completely overwhelmed by the enthusiasm. It's something I did not expect. And I would be merely rationalizing if I told you that I am able to describe my own feelings. It was breathtaking.
The change in Nelson Mandela's life was hard to comprehend. He'd spent the better part of 30 years in the bowels of a South African prison. Now he was a star, at the center of the world's attention. Perhaps because he'd never doubted this moment would one day arrive, he handled it all with remarkable dignity. Mandela understood how much South Africa was counting on him. The country had very nearly spiraled off into civil war. The government saw him as the best chance to restore peace and stability. Black South Africans saw him as their best hope for equality.
He stood for all of what we were looking for. His release would indicate that, hey, we are crossing the Jordan.
But for Mandela, that release meant just one thing: the chance to carry on his lifelong fight for a South Africa where one man meant one vote, and no man controlled another. Just 3 months after his release, Mandela was chosen to lead the African National Congress in an historic first official meeting with the government. After 3 days, the two sides committed themselves to peaceful change. Witnesses might never have suspected how bitter these enemies had been.
I think he realized early on that in order to create a unified, non-racial South Africa, it had to be done in a way that was totally devoid of bitterness. He couldn't be seen to be bitter. He had to be bigger than it all.
As he now traveled the globe, he was honored as a world leader and hailed as a hero. But back home, Mandela and the government got down to 3 very tough years of negotiations, and he proved to be a master politician. Without ever conceding on basic principles, Mandela also knew exactly when to compromise.
He is also someone who, as an astute politician, tries to make sure that you give space to the other person. Give the other person the opportunity of being able to save face. Don't rub his nose in the dust. Don't kick him when they're down.
But however great his negotiating skills, he could not save his unraveling relationship with his wife. As Winnie had become more autocratic and radical over the years, her public image had deteriorated. Now she was linked to the kidnapping and assault of a young boy, which ended in his death. Criminal charges were lodged against her. She was convicted of the kidnapping, but received a suspended sentence and a fine. Throughout the ordeal, Mandela stood by her. But then new scandals unfolded, including an affair with her young lawyer and allegations of financial misdealings.
He's a man of tremendous, tremendous loyalty, and he felt that Winnie had stuck by him for 27 years while he was in prison after just a few years of marriage, and he was going to stick by her come hell or high water. But at the same time, he felt angered and betrayed by her. The one person that he could be a private man with suddenly was no longer loyal to him.
Despite his profound feelings for Winnie, Mandela was left with no choice. He announced that he would leave her. For so long and deep a love to end this way was devastating.
I part from my wife with no recriminations. I embraced her with all the love and affection I have nursed for her, inside and outside prison. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll appreciate the pain I have gone through.
But however acute his pain over Winnie, he was achieving remarkable gains on the political stage. South Africa's first free elections were set for April of 1994. For the first time in more than 300 years since the nation was born, black South Africans would have the power to choose their rulers. Mandela had been fighting the official racism of South Africa nearly his whole life, and he won from the government far more than anyone had ever expected it to concede.
He's got iron will, if you want to know what makes him tick. He set his mind on doing something, and he becomes unshakable. We would never have been able to negotiate the end of apartheid without Nelson Mandela.
His tremendous achievement was acclaimed by the world. In December of 1993, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, together with South African President F.W. de Klerk. But there was no time to bask in the glory. Nelson Mandela was now the ANC's candidate for president, and at the age of 75, he would lead his party in its first election campaign.
One Mandela! One president!
His energy seemed boundless as he crisscrossed the country. To many, he appeared to be a man half his age. At last, Election Day arrived. On April 27, 1994, millions of black South Africans cast their ballots. In some areas, voters stood in line in the hot sun for up to 3 days to exercise this extraordinary new right. To no one's surprise, the African National Congress emerged victorious, with Nelson Mandela at the helm.
I think he never doubted that the ANC would be the government someday. I know that sounds almost delusional, but that was part of his strength, his great belief in himself, his great belief in the organization, and his great belief in the inevitability of the cause.
On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela took the presidential oath of office in Pretoria, once the very bastion of white power.
Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one or another. Let freedom reign. God bless Africa.
From herd boy in the Transkei to prisoner to president, Nelson Mandela now promised South Africa a new beginning. In May of 1994, Nelson Mandela had become president of South Africa in a landslide. Now he faced the enormous task of reconciling the people of his divided country and fulfilling the hopes of the vast black majority. The slogan for Mandela's presidential campaign had been "A better life for all," and his administration set about to deliver new homes, water, and electricity. Progress was made, but it barely dented the pervasive poverty that remains the legacy of apartheid. 5 years of Mandela could not erase 300 years of oppression. The political deal with the old order that brought Nelson Mandela to power kept the white business community in effective control of the country's resources. Many critics argued there had only been an elite transition, with black faces now in many positions once reserved for whites, but no fundamental transformation. The Mandela presidency was moderate in its economic program, but few had imagined that the new South Africa could achieve as much as it did in such a short period of time.
Mandela is a leader, he's a fighter, was a freedom fighter, and he's a person that can take very, very difficult decisions. Sometimes he goes where angels may fear to tread. That's Mandela.
Memories of the old South Africa were not forgotten in this new age. Together with Bishop Desmond Tutu, the Mandela government formed a Peace and Reconciliation Commission to investigate those who committed crimes in the apartheid era, and more importantly, to honor its victims.
I just think, that we are an incredibly blessed country. And of course, people now realize it. People who used to vilify him as a terrorist and so forth, everyone is eating out of his hand now. Everyone.
The demands of the presidency were very hard on Nelson Mandela. He had little time for himself and said he felt more freedom in prison than he did in office.
Well, no, the size is still the same.
But the rewards were considerable.
Mandela moves from kings and prime ministers to a beggar in the streets. Most of the time, his hand is outstretched towards ordinary people, particularly the poor, the disadvantaged, the people who otherwise may never be recognized. He has shaken thousands of hands. And he always says, you don't have to wait for people to stretch their hands. You stretch your hand first.
Mr. Mandela, Nelson Mandela, President of the Republic of South Africa.
Once lionized as a political prisoner, he became an icon for human rights globally, speaking out at the United Nations and around the world. He was cheered wherever he went. But Mandela did have his share of critics, and one of the most notable was Winnie Mandela. She charged he was far too concerned with allaying the fears of whites. In March of 1995, Mandela fired her from his cabinet for being uncooperative, and a year later, their personal breakup became final when he divorced her after 38 years of marriage. As South Africa recreated itself, Nelson Mandela found a new love and new wife in Graça Machel, a leader from Mozambique respected globally as an advocate for children. Mandela's country rallied behind their romance, which gave his personal life a fresh start at the age of 80. He also gave South African politics a fresh start. He supported the candidacy of his deputy president, Thabo Mbeki, the leader of the African National Congress, to succeed him. But when Mbeki took a controversial stand on AIDS, Mandela disagreed and spoke out against the stigma.
We need to break the silence.
He championed the cause of AIDS orphans like Nkosi Johnson, who became a symbol of the struggle against HIV, just as Mandela had earlier been the symbol of the freedom struggle.
I think Mandela leaves a very, very powerful legacy that is a sort of foundation stone for the new society. It may fade, it may go wrong, but I think that he's certainly given us a great opportunity. This country could have ended in a bloodbath, except for the man who has suffered more than anybody else, stepping out of prison and saying, I have no bitterness.
One of the great lessons of Nelson Mandela is a lesson about courage, both physical courage and moral courage. He was frightened. He was frightened many times throughout his life, but he would never show it. He triumphed over his fear by realizing that as a leader he had to show courage. And that is one of the great lessons that Mandela has to teach us.
He held this country together when we could have been blown to smithereens. He gave us freedom.
Today, South Africa is an unimaginably different place than it was years ago. Then, it seemed a very real possibility that the country might end in bloody self-destruction. That it didn't. That a man imprisoned for his politics for half his life should be the one to bring about peace is one of the more remarkable stories of the 20th century.
Throughout our lifetime, we have fought against white domination and have fought against black domination. We intend to remain true to this principle to the end of our days.
At age 85, he retired from politics as one of the best-known men in the world. Nelson Mandela had defied his jailers and oppressors, and gave the world gifts that few others could. Hope, love, joy, a new beginning, and truly a better life for all.